on this interaction. It's a shame that this LED isn't bright enough. I think next steps will be getting some brighter LEDs so that when I do this, you can actually see what's going on. Maybe I should try a coloured LED. Okay, I'm going to try a blue LED and a red LED and see if this works. So, go okay. Okay, so two LEDs I'm going to, two LEDs I'm going to try. Just to see if I can get it to show on camera. Let's make sure that's working. Yes, it is, but still incredibly dull. Try it with a different type of material. Got loads of capacitive touch samples here. So, trying this one now. It's quite annoying having to go between good lighting and bad lighting, but unfortunately it's what I need to do to show you that this is working. So it seems like the longer I make contact with this, the more sustained light we're getting. When I scrunch it, it's a little bit unpredictable what it does. Oh! So here, behind it, there's a lot more wire here at the back of the piece of embroidery. So maybe that little sustained burst of light that we got there has something to do with that, because I was holding it. And because there's a lot more wire there, there's a lot more sensor area for capacitance to be measured. Sometimes I get little false readings, but that's okay. It's important to note as well that my feet are firmly on the ground because the actual person involved in the capacitive touch experiment has to be grounded. Okay, so I say that's successful. Minus the horrendous lighting. But we do what we must. Okay, what shall I try next? Okay, I have my little embroider hoop. So on this, get the light back again so you can actually see what I'm trying to show you. So on this, there's loads of different embroidered marks. So there's little French knots here, cross stitch. There's points where I've cut material and sewn it back together. There's straight stitch. This was initially a material experiment to see how, these kind of stretchier sheer fabrics would respond to being sewn with copper thread. But now it's quite a nice example of a capacitance sensor. What you're seeing there is when I touch, these metallic parts, I'm getting a little response in the LED. So what you can't see off camera is that this hand is touching a piece of the copper wire. While I think this little embroider hoop's quite interesting to look at, quite a nice little visual artifact, its usefulness as a capacitive sensor is questionable at this point, but I think it's interesting how, there's a tactile nature to this. It kind of encourages you to touch these pieces of sewn together materials and bits of copper And I think that in itself, it's quite interesting to see how that interaction can be quantified. You can see, yeah, there we go. So in the chunkier bits of copper wire, as I touch this, I'm getting a better response from the LED. I do wonder how this would look in a serial monitor. I wonder if by looking at the values in the serial monitor you can tell which piece is getting touched on this, because there's lots of different types of stitches and densities of stitches. Anyway, moving on. So to attach all my pieces, I'm just using a little crocodile wire. So, my next little experiment is a piece of clay that I mixed with conductive ink material. I just stuck a wire in it. It's quite cute. So, just attaching this. Let's see what happens. So I don't know if this is an issue with the concentration of the ink. Oh, actually, so I didn't mix a great deal of the ink in with this. Well, it looks quite dark because of the ink. I don't think the concentration of, you know, the little filings that make the ink conductive, I don't think that concentration is high in this little material sample. So I'm noticing that the response from the LED is quite weak. Again, I do wonder how this would look in a serial monitor, because I think with the LED you can only see like sort of the high and the low points, especially because of the brightness of the LED. So put the light back on so you can see what I'm working with. So yeah, it's bare conductive ink mixed in with air drying clay. It's got a wire sticking into it. Very fun. You can still see some of the white from the clay, so the concentration of ink to clay isn't very high, which is probably what's giving us those kind of weak responses from the LED. So moving on again. Let's see what I've got. So I have a piece of knit that I've sewn some copper into. There's not very much copper in this, so I wouldn't be surprised if the capacitance and the capacity for capacitive sensing is kind of lackluster. So turn the light off again. Oh, we're seeing the slightest little flicker when I touch the copper. That's interesting. Oh, no, never mind. It's interesting because this has way less copper in it. I've kind of been a bit more deliberate with the placement of it. It's running in lines up and down the knit so that it's a bit less sensitive to touch and to movement. I deliberately did that because I wanted to just have a material sample that I could play around with that wasn't quite as sensitive as the others, so that perhaps to see if particular gestures made with the material and instances of touch and fiddling about with it and squishing it and squashing it would have a different effect. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. I think that's because I'm touching the actual crocodile clip. Yeah, that's what it is. I take that back. Okay, now I'm touching one of the lines of copper with both hands. And as we can see, we're getting quite a lot of nice little flickers. So, just to show you what I'm doing with the fabric, I'm turning the light back on. I really need to get some brighter LEDs to make this a little bit easier. But yeah, I'm just doing this. Just, you know, the kind of hand movements you do when you feel or find a really nice piece of material. You just want to squish it and scrunch it and, you know, just kind of doing what humans do when we feel nice things. So, on to the last piece. So, this is my little woven scrap. So this has a lot more copper in it than that last one. So this is just yarn woven in with copper. I have another version of this in the works that's, instead of using copper wire to weave with, it uses steel bound capacitive thread. So I'm still in the process of making that. It's going to be quite interesting when that's finished. The weave as well on that one's much tighter, much neater. This was my first ever attempt at weaving, so I do wonder if the actual construction of the fabric elements have an effect on the capacitance and how those capacitive materials kind of exist in the fabric and how they interact with other capacitive threads within that same piece of fabric. So I have a little tail here. I deliberately left this long so that it's very easy to snip this on and wrap it around. There we go. So turning the light off again. So I'm scrunching it. So I think because the weave of this fabric's very chunky, well, there's a lot of copper in it, I imagine a lot of it's kind of hidden by the fabric. And while that's not necessarily a problem, even if one of these strands of copper was completely encased in yarn, it should still create some capacitance. We could probably see that in the serial monitor easier than we can see it with the LED. I am finding that direct contact with the conductive or capacitive material itself, you know, like the copper or the conductive thread or the foil or the metal, that is creating kind of greater response with this little LED. But again, I think the serial monitor will tell us a couple of different things. This is just a kind of face value look to see what happens when we play with these little pieces of capacitant fabric. So this is the last time I'll be doing this. So turn this back on just to show you what I'm doing with it. So, because this has got so much copper in it, it kind of holds the shape of what you've been doing with it. So I've been scrunching it, I've been pulling it and squeezing it and all sorts. So it just kind of sits like that. And that is the end of this experiment. I think my next steps will be looking to see how all these materials interact with the serial monitor. But I think that this is a good first step